one of the really unique things about my candidacy for the Senate is no one has the same perspective of being Speaker of the House and having a front row seat to how important it is that the federal government stays inside its lane. The amount of resources and time and brain damage that we spend in this state because the federal government is doing stuff to us that it shouldn't do and not doing things it should do is remarkable.
Brain damage is such a great describer.
Yeah.
Brain damage.
And even the dollars that we spend fixing things the federal government has been negligent on is really something that citizens of the state, I'm not sure they even at times have line of sight to, but
when you start talking about the number of zeros, though, like when you really think like a trillion is 12 zeros, most people can't conceptualize what that actually means. Like there's a few like video graphics that you can put together that help, but I think still to this day, you hear those big numbers and they're just oblivious to it.
Well, yeah, and there's $34 trillion of debt that are being put upon our kids and our grandkids right now.
Yeah, it's an invisible tax. I mean, inflation and that debt is an it's an unelected tax. It's a tax that we are all going to have to pay. And how we do that, though, is going to be there's a thousand ways to slice that up. But ultimately, we can't just keep ignoring it, right? So what do you think? If you could, obviously you can't wave your wand and just say, hey, this is going to fix it. But where do you think are practical steps of starting to chip away, not only at that deficit, but also, at that federal level? Where do you think some of these cuts should come from? Maybe first or second, or what do you think? There's a real strategy there?
Well, there has to be. You've got to change the system back there. The fact that there's no mechanism that requires the federal government to balance their budget is insane to me. It's crazy to me. And we've got to have a balanced budget amendment or something back there that requires that to happen. And you have so few people that have experience back there balancing a budget for government and also business experience. And that's one of the things that I think I'm at an advantage of bringing back there. But with that all being said, once you change the system, once you say, yeah, you've got to balance the budget, you'll see very different behaviors. You'll start to see hard decisions being made. You'll also see less printing of money, creating this inflation that's hurting Utah families. And there's so many ways to cut spending in this country. There's so much waste in government spending. The other thing that you would see differently is you'd start to see finally the federal government saying, wait, this actually isn't our job. Why are we even doing this? The fact that we have a Department of Education at the federal level is insanity to me. That is not a responsibility that the federal government has. It's very clear it doesn't have that responsibility. Yet we've given them power. They have influence in our education system. And listen, I'm all for a strong education system. But we've talked at the beginning of this conversation about that's something that should be done at a local level. You have the school district here in Washington County. That's their job. Yeah. Federal government doesn't have a responsibility there.
Well, part of me thinks like the idea behind the Department of Education, when it was the inception of it, I think there was a lot of great arguments for having some kind of oversight in the amount of money that we could flood into different areas, right? There's a disparity between one area to the next with education, even financially, their ability, right? Some schools literally get issued, the kids get iPads. All of them, that's part of their, that's just part of their, it's not like they get books anymore. They get an actual iPad in some schools versus others that are dealing with old, outdated textbooks, right? So I can see how there's some of this element of it seemed good at the time, but when it's not working anymore, it seems almost impossible for the federal government to be like, hey, we made a mistake. We tried. This seemed like a good idea at the start, but now it's almost like they just keep throwing money at it to try to solve the problem, and they can never really turn it around. Why do you think this balanced budget approach or requirement hasn't passed up to this point?
Well, lack of political courage. I mean, plain and simple. There's not enough people back in Washington that are serious enough about their jobs to make a difference and leave the place a better place than they found it. And until we elect people in Washington that are going to take a different approach, we're going to get the same outcomes. And if we want different outcomes in Washington, we need to elect different people.
Yeah.
And think about what we're doing to our kids and our grandkids. I mean, you talk about this invisible tax, but my generation, we didn't get any kind of debt foisted upon us like we're giving to the next generation. And it's astounding to me that we're doing this and no one's talking about it. So we've got to fix it. We've got to go back and have someone that's going to help lead the charge. One of the things that's interesting, the U.S. Senate is the great equalizer in American politics. California has 53 members of the House. Utah has 4. California has 2 U.S. senators. So does Utah.
Yeah.
This election has serious consequence for our state. And we've got to make sure that we elect someone that's going to go back and represent Utah's values. It's going to do the heavy lifting. That's going to be a rock-ribbed Republican, because this is going to be a Republican seat. We know this. This is Utah.
Right. Still is.
Yep. And
still Utah.
We're going to elect a Republican.
Yep.
The question is, what kind of Republican? And I believe
there's a lot of definitions these days.
There is
for Republicans.
Yeah, and Utah will decide what kind of Republican they're going to send back there. And what I'm telling people, what my message is, if you want to elect someone that's a conservative fighter, that's got a track record of bringing conservative outcomes into public policy, into this state. And what I hear over and over again is, Brad, could you go make Washington look more like Utah, where you balance your budget, where you've cut taxes consistently year after year, where you've constrained government spending, where you actually believe in the Second Amendment and pass constitutional carry. And, the list of things goes on and on. Those are the kinds of things people want to elect someone to Washington in our U.S. Senate seat to go back and do. And I think they also feel at this time, for a lot of different reasons, that they want someone that has a very consistent track record, that has represented conservative values their whole life. I've been involved in conservative politics since I was a teenager.
How would you – I have a hard time getting people to answer this, or at least there's not like an agreed upon. What are conservative values? Like, what would you give what are like 3-4 conservative values?
I'll tell
maybe?
You, sure. We're an outlier in Utah. We are still a state, and I think conservative values, at least the Utah way, is we believe in hard work still.
Okay.
We believe in personal responsibility, not government handouts. We want low taxes. We want small government. We believe in the family. It's a cornerstone of society, and we're going to do everything we can to protect it. Those are some examples of conservative values.
Okay.
And look at that list and compare that list to California.
Yeah.
Compare that.
I try not to compare. I came from California in 2015. My wife and I moved here. She was born and raised there. I was born up in Sandy. And so I lived a little bit of my life up in Salt Lake and a little in New Mexico and a little in California. And now we moved here in 2015. And yeah, it's a night and day difference. I mean, the way from the politics to the culture, right? It's completely different.
But think about what I said, just, kind of at the beginning of that list of hard work and personal responsibility.
Yeah.
There are places in this country right now, both at a state level and the federal government, where people are better off not working and getting a government handout than they are going out and getting a job.
Yeah.
And there are political leaders that are okay with that and have enabled that to happen. That is not the way we do things in Utah.
Yeah.
And how do we get more of that into DC?
Yeah. I think too, we end up at the political level, it's a game. A lot of times the politicians end up playing the game rather than go to solve the problems. I'll use immigration, and I didn't want to necessarily bring up immigration, but hearing the Republicans not support any bill moving forward specifically, and this is just from what I've heard in multiple news sources, is that they don't want to give the Biden administration the win heading into the election of saying we pass some kind of immigration policy to change what's happening down there. And when I hear that, I can't help but think, are we so blinded by the partisan politics, so blinded by the game, that we're not actually just trying to solve the problems? Yeah. It's so frustrating to me to see that happen.
Well, I hope that's not the case. I hope we solve the problem. And here's why. Your bill, your share of the bill right now, and my share of the bill is probably $2,000 to $3,000, maybe more, at a state, local, and federal government from a budget standpoint of what our share is of the immigration crisis in this country. It's not just creating a humanitarian crisis where you've got 10 million people here illegally, for example, maybe, in that range.
I think 7 million over the last 2 years.
Yeah. Biden opened up the borders when he became president.
It's crazy.
No doubt about it. And I say this tongue in cheek, but it's harder to get into a BYU football game than it is to get across the border right now.